Gentlemen, welcome to the BEBC budget. It's respectfully acknowledged that we're proceeding on the traditional ancestral lands of the Jewish people where we live. Motion to adopt the agenda. Okay. Inspiration.
Thank you. This is a special meeting of the Board of Education and Business budget, and as part of the budget presentation, we'll look at potential use of future surplus. We prepared an updated year-end projection as of March 31st, 2023. So I would like to first begin by sharing that document. I'm going to put it on the screen here and do a quick walk through how this has changed. It's up there since we last met. It's like a nice and big grid. There we go. So this projection is prepared before we have received information funding on the February count. So we do believe from the numbers that have been submitted will be higher than we have anticipated. So I've not brought those revenues in yet from the February count that I believe will be increasing our overall bottom line. This hasn't been announced yet by the ministry. So we show a provincial grant on budget because we set the budget to what we had prior to the February count. So of course it's on budget. Just a bit better on ISP than what we had in the budget originally. And you can see the other variances there around. So right now we look to be about $148,000 above our revenue projections. Biggest swing being on interest revenue as that has continued to increase over the year with the Bank of Canada lending rate. As we go down into our salaries, a little more variation in here. When we last were here, we had fully reconciled our teacher salaries between the Classroom Enhancement Fund and the operating fund. So there are two separate funds that we have that pay for our teachers. Classroom Enhancement Fund is the fund that supports the additional teachers that we have for the restoration of the collective agreement that happened in 2015, 2016. So there's about 80 teachers over there, and there's about 450 in the operating fund. And a few teachers had taken leaves, and their replacements had been coded into the operating fund rather than back to the Classroom Enhancement Fund. So when we were able to reconcile the teaching component, we realized that we had teachers in the operating fund that were in fact supposed to be in the Classroom Enhancement Fund, made the adjustment, and now we see a surplus of $230,000 there. The last time it looked like it was behind by about $80,000. So that's where the state comes from on this projection from last month. The rest of it seems relatively consistent with as I had previously reported. We made some adjustments around utilities to show a little bit of surplus that we see happening in those accounts. Some overage on our dues and fees, for instance. But overall, we think we're going to come in under expenditures by about $950,000. So when you add that revenue to that, we would be projecting our year-end surplus at about 1% of budget, $1.1 million. So that number is going to show up a few times when I go through the budget position document. But I just wanted to start with this and ask if there's any questions. Of course, the closer we get to the end of the year, the better we get with our projections because the unknowns disappear. The predictability becomes more stronger. So really why this projection swung, a little bit better on our interest revenues, and we've reconciled the teachers to a more fine level of detail. Not hearing anything, I'm moving into the PowerPoint. Here on the screen, and you all have this in your packages. Prepared over the weekend, be available. Here we go. This is a long one. There's about 40 slides here. I have a lot to tell you about our budget. I have a lot to tell you about the possible options. So on your desktops as well, a bit of a read-along document. So for trustees, what you have here on the one column is our opening position with all the programs and the functions. It's quite high level, but what it will show you is what we had when we came up with the figure of a shortfall of 2.881 million, which is down here at the very bottom. Where that came from. So that was the difference between our revenue and our expenditure. And as we talk about some of the options, you're going to see that there's a column with the corresponding note. Those notes are attached to the backside here. So it's the sort of a, you may not even have to go to it, but if you need to, I've seen it, if you need to, how we need to come up with a population or why we're making a suggestion, this is what we come for you. I'll further explain the options that will show up on the presentation. So I'll have that for you. We thought it would be. So we are talking about the 2023-2024 annual budget. We will focus tonight on the operating budget, which is the budget for which we have the board has the most discretion over. We will get into a couple of special purpose funds as well that are relevant because there are some ties to the operating budget. To begin, I always think it's good to ground ourselves in the budget guiding principles that the board has already adopted. You did this earlier this year. I think they were adopted in February, so they would be rated on the survey, but came through the January Board Education and Business Committee. And, you know, those are that we need to align with the priorities of Beyond Education, the strategic plan. We developed the budget as a mechanism for aid and reconciliation. It's developed on the principle of equity, and it must be transparent. So we are in a public meeting that is open for public viewing, and we have partners in attendance. But we also continue to communicate through the budget process and after the budget process with those partners. We need to account for uncertainties of inflationary pressures, and we're going to be talking a lot about inflation tonight. And then there's the legislative requirements of the School Act, collective agreements, and board policy that we follow. So in other words, our budget must balance. And of course, we can't budget for less salaries than have been bargained, for instance. And then we have to think about multi-year implications of decisions and short and long-term priorities. And then always think about a contingency balance, because that is what gets us through the hard times. And if there's any variance on the budget that we hadn't projected. And we have our core priorities, learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, culture of care, and future focused system. So that's sort of the grounding. I used this slide last year. The main theme of the 2023-2024 annual budget, again, is going to be inflation. This is where our challenge is coming from. As I've said at the last BEBC, the reason inflation is a challenge is it's not part of our funding. So we have wages which were funded by government, but nowhere in the public sector did government build inflation into the funding of various ministries. And so we now, that's now left to school boards to find ways to manage that inflation. And so far, the board has been quite active. They have established, you've engaged in the community to collect information in order to establish your priorities. You established the budget guiding principles. You issued a survey on the budget. You held a liaison meeting with rights holders. That was a separate meeting. You had liaison meetings with DSAC, the teachers, the USW, QP, Principals Association, and DPAC. You held a public feedback meeting on the budget, and we had a great turnout with, I think, about 10 individuals, which was a success compared to most years. You've been to the advisory committee where you asked for feedback on the budget assumptions that we'd be using to create this budget. And you've been continuing to receive information from staff at Board of Education and Business Committee meetings and board meetings. So you have been in the budget for a while. And then at the last BEBC, you reviewed the ministry funding announcement, where we talked about the change in the operating grant rates. We talked about the changes in our operating grant revenues and our expected changes in the operating expenditures. And we talked about the assumptions that we had used to create that opening budget position and provided you an updated surplus reconciliation. So at this meeting, our intent is to review some options, to invite trustees to provide feedback and recommendations, and to review 2 primary special purpose funds. So as I go through this presentation, there may, sorry.
Just in terms of feedback and recommendations, do recommendations need to be a motion, or do they just need to be conversation? Okay, great. Thank you so much.
When we did our test run with staff, they had lots of questions, and most of the questions showed up in a slide or 2 after, because it was prompted by a slide that I was just on. Just keep that in mind, that I may have the answer coming up, but I'm always happy to stop and tell you that that's on two slides from now as well, if you have the question in the moment. I think there's also important, I wanted to make sure I reviewed with trustees that this process isn't the only way that you receive information that informs you in a budget cycle. So just, what I just went over, that you issued a survey and you met with the partners through your liaison meetings. You year-round attend advisory committee meetings and receive feedback on issues of importance to the school district and its employees from the people at those meetings. While we're bargaining, which we just did, the union proposals bring forward issues that are important to the employee groups that get communicated. There are often delegations to the board at open and closed board meetings. You rotate attendance at District Student Advisory Committee to hear the voices of learners on a regular monthly basis. You have conversations collectively and individually with members of the broader community. There is regular attendance of school and district teams at board, education, and business committee meetings. We have these monthly that demonstrate how the resources that you're providing are translated into successful learning initiatives. And then we bring to you regular year-end financial projection updates that relay how the budget performance is actually aligning to the plans that have been put in place. So it highlights areas that can be increased or decreased. So beyond the last couple of months where you've been really thinking about budget, I just wanted to highlight, I believe you're always thinking about budget and you're always receiving feedback through the budget outside of this official budget cycle. And there's ways too that staff are always taking feedback from the board. Decisions around budget priorities are communicated to staff to implement beyond the official budget process as well. The board provides additional direction to staff through your value statements and strategic priorities. So you're setting the guidelines for which the staff operate. The decisions at the board table over the course of this term. So we watch the decisions that you make that reflect your values. And then the questions asked and opinions stated at the planning session. So when you're showing your curiosity in an area, you also pick that up. The whole district leadership team attends all meetings of the board to ensure that the directions of the board are understood and implemented within the constraints of the budget. And so district staff are always also receiving feedback for 12 months of the year on the budget priorities. Just wanted to kind of bring it into the full cycle. Some new announcements since we met in March. I was off the email chain for some reason, so I got this one late, as a number of secretary treasurers did. But on March 21st, the 2022 shared recovery mandate, so I'm going to use that SRM a few times in here, was announced, and we were waiting to find out whether or not wages would be the minimum of 5.5% that were bargained in the collective agreement, or whether they would be the maximum of 6.75%. And you might remember I said we budgeted on 6.75, and I put a plug in the revenue for what I thought was going to be coming from government. So it is in fact 6.75. So our opening expenditure position was done correctly. But we have yet to receive that confirmation on that $950,000 that I'm currently using as an estimate for the funding of that 1.25%. We have also received no information on principal, vice principal, and exam staff agreements. But we know that typically they are aligned with that of the teachers. So if the teachers get a raise, then usually the principal grade moves, but it's up to the board to make a decision whether you're going to give it or not. And at this time, no funding has been announced for those salary adjustments, and the 2023 window has not opened where the board can consider increases. So I think that's relevant, because I'm going to go over that a little bit later on in this presentation.
Excuse me, you have a question.
Didn't we already do that?
Sorry.
Through the chair to the secretary treasurer, didn't we already do that?
Include 6.75?
Oh, not include, sorry.
We did for teachers and support staff, but we did not for principals and exempt, because we have no mandate for that yet. But I've costed it, and it's going to show up in the presentation. Also announced on April 4th was a new fund called Feeding Futures Fund. And that Feeding Futures School Food Program funding, that is expected to be ongoing funding that ensures that all students are fed and ready to learn by expanding existing food programs in districts. I'm basically reading the press release that I put in here. So the school district is going to receive $1,018,779 for this next school year. But that means that the Student and Family Affordability Fund, that $880,000 received this year, is no longer continuing. So that's over, and it's now been replaced. The board currently allocates a portion of the community link funding for staff that deliver and prepare food at the school level and for the purchase of food. Now, this is important. This $250,000 is now an eligible expenditure of Feeding Futures Fund. So we'll come back to that concept a little bit later in this presentation.
Mr. Chair, I should say, pardon me. So just to be really clear, the affordability fund gone, the school district is no longer helping people address inflation except for food.
Well,
That's it. That's all we can spend that money on. Sorry.
correct. The Student and Family Affordability Fund had a very broad. You could choose to do a number of things. Now it has been focused on food security, which was also part of this. So before that, glasses for a child or paying for a dentist, and no longer can happen with gas cards or some of those other inflation. It's new rules. So we identified at the March 28th meeting a budget shortfall of $2,881,831. That is an opening number on the sheet that you have on the left-hand column at the very, very bottom. And that was prior to applying any surplus or adjustments. So that's a very a big number, but we know we have surplus that can help to address some of that. So when we did that projection, we assumed $950,000 will be coming for that cost of living allowance increase that took the salaries from 5.5 to 6.75, still unconfirmed. We made an assumption that the benefit rates for dental and health for teachers and principals and vice principals will increase by 10%. Still don't know those rates yet, but we did know what QPs were and we did know what still workers were. We made an assumption that our demerits in the 2024 WorkSafe will approximate 50%. That was using a WorkSafe estimator. Could be something different, but that's the best guess we could come up with. We're making an assumption that the Bank of Canada will hold interest rates and not decrease them in 23-24. So there has been some talk in the media about stability, but it still sounds like the next shift is probably not down, but up again, because inflation has not stabilized at the level that the Bank of Canada had intended it to. And then we're not sure how the global inflation might affect enrollment in the international student program. So these are just I'm bringing you forward some risk factors that still exist in the budget. We also do not know the effect of the shared recovery mandate for principals and vice principals. So again, is that going to be funded? And it's going to be permitted to provide 6.75%. Previous salary direction was to cap any increase at 5%. For those groups. So are they going to be under different rules, or are there new rules for principals and exempt? We don't know yet. But we do know that it was funded in the year that we're in right now. So 2022-2023, for the first time ever, in my memory, principal and exempt staff salaries were funded, and likely because the cost pressure on boards is quite significant. And if you don't make those adjustments, eventually the salaries of the highest paid teacher will exceed the salary of the vice principal, elementary vice principal, which is the lowest admin step, which creates a compression problem. And how do you recruit into a position where you work more days of the year and you earn less money? So there's those issues that have to be thought about here. But rough cost, $655,000 for that 6.75% if it applies against the exempt and principal group. I'm gonna keep moving. So here's a snapshot of what's in the budget right now. What makes up the $105 million that we're showing in expenditures. What we've done here is we've listed the FTE, so that's full-time equivalent, not the number of bodies, but the equivalent of one full person. So for teachers, that's pretty understood. You teach a full day, or you're teaching every day of the week. But for education assistants, they're usually 5.5 hours, so 152 probably translates to 200. For instance, clerical, that's based on a 35-hour week, but when we move into the USW, it's based on a 40-hour week for custodians and maintenance, etc. So there's a listing. It's for your information on the types of positions that the board budgets for. 807 cost. And then below that, we have substitutes. That's not all sick leave. That includes vacation coverage for QP and USW who have vacation. That includes in-service. That includes maternity leave. That includes long-term leave. So not just the day-to-day stuff for significant periods. That includes some Pro-D coverage. So it's expanded just beyond sick leave. And here you see our benefits listed by statutory pension and health. Pension rates are quite stable. Statutory are starting to stabilize. Health rates are going up. And then we break it out. This really mirrors our budget summary, which is why I presented it this way, because you'll see it presented like this when you finally have the budget sorted. But here you can also see the various categories as well around utilities and supplies and insurance, for instance. And then operating capital. So that's some further information for you on how the board is distributing the resources. I also wanted to highlight what's in the budget. We have new trustees that may not be aware of some recent decisions that previous boards had made that have been carried forward. So in that opening position, the board in the last couple of years, and I've only gone back 2 years, has enhanced literacy and numeracy programs through a district office position, as well as 2 in-school embedded literacy coordinators. So the board has invested, $418,000 into literacy and numeracy programs in the last couple of years, and that still remains in the budget. The board, I've also put some strategic priorities on the other side for how they align, but we could all use our own discretion as to which one it fits, because some things fit more than one, and it just picked up quickly there. Additional mental health supports. So that was a priority of last year's budget, and that has rolled over. That's in addition to $52,000 of the government fund. Strategic planning implementation. It supports all the strategic priorities, but the board has $50,000 for initiatives that support the strategic plan. We have left in the additional cleaning that we put in place, which is basically portable hand washing stations and portable hand sanitizer stations. So we realized that everybody thought that the hand cleansing practices that were developed with children in schools during COVID was a good idea to continue, because it was just good practice overall. And so the board supported that with $50,000 last year to ensure that continued. Additional assessments for students that were waiting. Special education equipment rolling over. The updated website is a 2-year project. This is to keep that going. I think we'll see some changes on that shortly. And you had previously decided on a custodial equipment replacement. And then automated call-out system. That's actually going to net a savings. That budget that I'll show over there. So there's $713,000 of really good stuff that's still in the budget from previous decisions.
Steve Souza.
Sorry, additional assessments. Can you elaborate a little bit?
I think I'll defer to the superintendent, but that's around school psychologists meeting with children to begin to identify supports that they may require at an early level or more frequent level.
I'm not sure if this is true or not. Are we hiring a school psychologist, or do we have challenges in finding one during our various hiring adventures?
I think we're good right now. But the teachers union, but they have their own professional status with underneath that realm.
Okay, thank you.
So I just wanted to highlight this because I think newer trustees may not be aware of some of the things that are already in the budget for the recent decisions. Then I want to talk about when you're budgeting, a budget shortfall or structural deficit exists when budgeted expenditures exceed budgeted revenues. And so if there is a shortfall, the board needs to implement strategies to balance the budget, and those would include utilization of prior year surplus. So spending the money you have in the bank, reducing expenditures or increasing revenues. Those are really the ways that we balance the budget. And you have received many requests and suggestions for areas that the budget could enhance services, supplies, equipment, and staffing levels. So through your conversations that you've had to date on the budget in this cycle. But in a budget shortfall, adding to the budget becomes increasingly difficult without a corresponding reduction in any area. So as you add, you just increase the shortfall and have to find a way to reduce that somewhere else. So it is challenging. And that's where priorities have to be balanced. But just wanted to highlight that it's nobody ever comes and asks an elected board of trustee to take something out of the budget that they could do. You asked questions when you were doing your liaison meetings. What can we do more of? Use more of? What can we do the same? What can we use less of? There wasn't a lot of responses on what we could use less of. It's the needs of the system. There always are more. So that makes budgeting also quite complex. Because I know you would wish to answer all this because money and finances were unlimited. And as we open the budget position, this is what it looks like. Wages and benefits is increasing because wages and benefits have increased. So we're now at about almost 90.5% wages and benefits, which puts us at about 9.5% services and supplies. So if you think about that 9.5% of services and supplies, so I'm going to have an inflation conversation. Think about that on a $100 million budget, it's about $10 million. If inflation last year is 7% and government hasn't funded inflation outside of wages, that 7% is immediately almost a $700,000 budget pressure without even looking at increases in sick leave, increases in benefit rates. That's just on the services and supplies. So that's part of where the challenge comes in balancing. So I just want to highlight that, and that's partly why this slide is here. So here we go. This is where you could follow along on the guide if you like, but I'll basically have it in my head and be reading away. So what could you do to help balance a $2.8 million shortfall? You could consider appropriating some surplus, and I've just put a number here of $2 million at this point, and I'll show you what that looks like as we go through the presentation. I'll show you later what's left and what it would look like to enhance that amount and what would be left if you chose to do that as a percentage of your budget. We're also at the very, very end going to look at a 3-year projection that we've prepared. We could go a little further if we think that the Bank of Canada is going to hold rates for the year and not decrease them, and certainly at this point, indication is that they're probably going to rise again at some point in the future before they start coming down again. We have a little more room we could go on the projection around our interest revenue, because as I mentioned, every 0.25% is $50,000, and we're already being a little bit conservative on the revenues we're bringing in from interest revenue. So if you did those things, you would have a shortfall of $831,000. And when we looked really closely at our average teacher salary, so what we do is we take our budget as it exists today, everybody that we have hired for the school district right now, and we roll it into next year. And we use a very sophisticated budget program that has every individual by name, what salary they earn, what benefit plans they belong to, and we update the pay tables. And that gives us a new estimated teacher salary for the next year. When we look at that, we know a couple of things happen. One, people will retire and be replaced by less expensive teachers before we open the doors in September again. We also know that it's not just September that people retire or leave or go off on leave, maybe on medical leave, but when that happens, they're almost always replaced by a newer teacher who costs less than the person who's gone off on leave. Simply by rolling everybody forward at today's cost doesn't necessarily, we believe when we did an analysis on it, that we had overestimated next year's salary. So this is very common that we'll often look for an adjustment on the teacher average salary as a way to balance the budget. And we believe that we're too high at this moment on our average teacher salary. It's approaching $95,000 before benefits. It's approaching $120,000 with benefits. But even a $500 difference if we're out on 500 teachers is your $250,000. And I think we're out that 500.
You finish your note.
So just for the folks at home who may not have dealt with these terms before, average teacher salary is not $250,000. Average teacher salary is closer to 95 to 120, right? Okay.
It's not one individual.
Right.
It's collectively, when you look at everybody, if we put too much money aside for what we believe the average teacher salary to be, we're gonna end up with that generating a surplus in the next year. So we think we're too high. When we take if you take today's average teacher salary and you add 6.75% to it, and you add in all the increments for all the people who aren't at the top step, that number should be lower than what we're currently showing in our budget opening draft. In my view. So that's why we're making a suggestion that there's this room there. And we believe the risk on that is reduced because we know we're going to have some retirements, even though they're not coming in that fast, because this is going to be the biggest salary increase in decades in this next year. And why wouldn't you want that one in your pension years? But we always will have people go off. And be replaced by less expensive teachers. And the range between that top step and your teacher is pretty significant. $1,000. So I don't think I need to add up to this savings. So that's why we're using the comparable. We move on to the next one.
Through the chair. Secretary Treasurer. In chatting with some other districts, some conversations that I've had lately, we're seeing a trend of teachers not retiring because of the wage increase over the next 3 years. So I know that we're projecting out 3 years, and with this wage increase over the next 3 years, are we being cautious enough, do you believe?
On this number? I think leave replacements alone will meet this number. So individuals who go off and are replaced by a less expensive teacher throughout the year will meet this number. And it's partly one of the reasons why over the year, when I renew projections through the board, and the teacher number just seems to always be seen as far as the surplus that's generated in that account. It's because the leaves start to accumulate and start to generate those savings. They're not there in September or October. They come as people go off throughout the year, and particularly, I think it's pretty safe number. Thank you.
I know that we've had a system over the last term on how we spent our dollars with the different levels of operations, everything else that has been working. We know we've depended on teachers retiring to bring in new teachers at a lower price. Again, I know Trustee Smith kind of asked the question that my concern. So I'm a bit, and I have to apologize because that really showed me for a prior that I can't disagree with.
Part of our funding formula. So these savings really need to happen after September 30th on average teacher salary. And the reason for that is we're funded on the comparison of our average teacher salary to the lowest one in the province. So there's this funding reconciliation that happens when we receive our funding in December based on our average teacher salary in September. So if everybody retired and all new teachers came in and our average teacher salary went down, so would our funding. If nobody retired and they retired in everybody else's school district, and they didn't retire here, and our salaries were higher, we'd get more funding. So there's this system in place to ensure there's no disincentive for a school district to say when you're, to have discriminatory, it's not necessarily for discriminatory, but it prevents discriminatory hiring practices of looking at, the newer teacher and saying, well, we can get that person for step 2 of grade 5 instead of hiring the master's step 10 senior teacher who's sitting, who's the other person who could be hired, because we're funded on our average. So there is a reconciliation that will happen, but I still think this number is a safe one. We can get into that more detail later if you want to see the point. The other one I have here, when we're doing absenteeism projections, you look at the previous year's trends. So if we are 10% higher at September 30th, 10% higher at March 31st than we were the previous year, I take 10% and I add it to the end of the year balance from the previous year and just assume that that trend continues. So if the end of the year balance in 2022 was $2 million and we're 10% higher in March, my projection that I show you is we're going to be $220,000. But April, May, and June last year were not normal. They were really unusual in that usually the sun comes out, it's not so great right now. In April, spring breaks happen, people have had a rest of 2 weeks, and schools become actively more exciting with field trips, and you're starting to see summer on the end, and you're hanging on, and you don't use as much sick leave through April, May, and June. It's a trend. You could look at it for the last 2 decades, and you would see spring break happens, woof, dives off. The big months are November through to March for absenteeism when it comes to sick leave, and last year was not that at all. And I would say that was simply the effect of the lingering effects of the Omicron variant, which we know arrived in its most significant form around February, March, and continued on to take people out of the system on prolonged sick leave right through the end of June. So what we're saying is we think that so far that trend is not happening post spring break, even though we've only had a few weeks of it this year. We think that we can adjust our absenteeism for next year.
Chair, just a question in regards to like a culture shift for us to consider, because throughout the pandemic, there has been this stay home, don't go to work when you're unwell. And is that incorporated in this?
Yes, we've made some really big adjustments this year because that has happened. So your budget starts off $700,000 higher in absenteeism than the previous year, just because of the culture trend. Partly because of the culture trend, partly because again we're still working through a lot of illness in the schools. But I think that it's still probably true that our staff are healthier in the months of April through June typically, because it's sunny and and you've made it through winter and optimism and the end is near, and and usually June is a month of very, very low sick usage for all staff compared to other months. But last year it wasn't. I think we have a question.
Oh, trustee Crawford.
I'm guessing as well in terms of those months being lower for illnesses, it's largely to do with being outside. I mean, kids are outside a lot more. The teachers are outside a lot more.
I think that's probably true. And people are outside more than doing indoor activities. Probably true. It's a suggestion that we think will materialize. The automated call-out system, when it's fully implemented, which is expected to be next year, will have some additional costs for the software, but it will reduce a position that's associated with it. So that was already in place from this year, and we'll be realizing those savings in the next school year. So there's much more need to talk about that one. Major adjustment has happened in our distributed learning enrollment, partly it really spiked during COVID with families choosing for their children to learn not in a school setting, but from home. And then subsequent, our numbers have dropped quite significantly this year, but we haven't made an adjustment to the supply allocation that corresponds with that enrollment drop. And then next year, our district wasn't selected as one of the provincial delivery schools, or districts for DL. So we're really looking at our program compressing even further, and we had that in our enrollment projections. So there's a corresponding supply allocation that we believe we can make a reduction on, because we won't have as many children participating. And then here's where we play some shell game suggestions. If all food programs get consolidated into the new fund, which is permissible for boards and part of the calls that we were on, so you could take the funding that's currently in the community link for food and move it to a single source fund, the Feeding Futures. That would free up in Clink, Community Link, $250,000, where you could then move from your operating fund, which you used to have in there, your early learning coordinator, and 2 youth support workers. That frees up operating dollars and reduces the deficit. Kind of following? Expenses from operating into Clink, expenses from Clink into Feeding Futures. Food's now all sorted in one central place. Link is, and I'll get into the community link reconciliation later on in my presentation, but I'm presenting this to you as a potential option. If those things happened, now we're getting a little bit closer. We have just added $685,000 in potential expenditure reductions, and that takes the budget position to about $150,000, which is very small on $105 million. We're getting close. But there's some things to think about adding. There's lots of things to think about adding. I just put this here to hold this number, 655,000. In the absence of any funding at this point, this could become a pressure for the board. We hopefully will know by the time we're done the budget whether the boards will be expected to fund principal, vice principal increases on their own. I actually don't think we'll know by the time we're finished our budget. And I imagine that we'll likely leave this out to the side and deal with it once the mandate comes in and the budget has been adopted. But I want to highlight that it's a real expenditure, because we need to recognize that compression will begin to occur if those groups aren't recognized. And I know you've heard lots of things from groups, but a lot of what we've heard through the liaisons was already happening, or was sort of beyond the financial feasibility of adding to a budget that's already in a significant shortfall position. So that was one of the reasons I highlighted all of the services that were in the budget that was rolled over, because you heard about a lot of those issues through your liaison meetings. So I just put a holder here as a possible add. We did hear about equipment replacement for the trades. So I put that in here with a small amount, of course, not being inclusive of what had been asked for, but maybe a multi-year plan. But after that would put you back to $826,000 in the hole. So some things that we think are options. If the board were to strike the PVP compensation off this list, you'd be at $171,000 shortfall. And I can show you what that looks like if you were to do that to balance the budget. That surplus, without doing anything further to make reductions to the system. So maybe I'll halt here and see if there's any questions on any of those items before I move forward.
Questions?
Okay. Eduardo has one.
I'm just especially with back to the SRM. Still having a hard time understanding.
What was it?
Yeah.
Sure. For all the public sector, a provincial mandate was delivered for bargaining for wages, that for year 2 of the collective agreements. So not just for school system, but this would be health and other areas, provincial government. The government was going to guarantee that staff would receive 5.5%. But if inflation exceeded that 5.5%, they were going to guarantee that it would be their salaries would be adjusted not from 5.5 up to 6.5. So if inflation had been 6%, the wages for QE and teachers would be 6%. So they would have made a 0.5% adjustment from that guaranteed 5.5. It topped out at 6.75. So if inflation had been 10%, we were going to be paying 6.75. So it needs to be reconciled based on the March to February consumer price index. So that's the CPI. So that's a measurement of the cost of goods in the community in the province of BC. So when that number came in and was I'm sure all of the various union groups held the province to account on that number because it was so meaningful, needed to be audited and confirmed. It was 7.1% was the CPI. So in fact, staff wages have not kept up with inflation, but they have gotten very, very close. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we didn't get that information. We knew a year ago it was going to be 5.5, but we didn't know what the balance was going to be until February concluded. And that applies to the entire public sector that bargained under that mandate. So for next year, might as well keep going. Next year's wages that are effective July 1st, 2024 are 2% with the possibility of increasing to 3%. So what we would call the SRM next year is 1%, not 1.25 like this year. And if inflation continues, at its pace, then we can likely assume that it will be the 3% next year. But again, we'll have to wait until March 21st of 2024 before we know what it's going to be for the next year. So, what does the surplus currently look like? We ended the year with 7.1 million, of which some was restricted, that $1 million that I'm showing there on the third line. And the board used 1.796 to balance the current year. You started out with more, but you generated more funds throughout the year and had to rely on it less as you concluded this year's budget. So we see the unrestricted surplus at the end of the year at 4.2 million. So that's money that has not been touched. Isn't based on us projecting what this year's going to look like. That is in the bank from last year. I showed you a surplus projection of 1.1 million, which would mean that we'd be projecting at the end of the year $5.4 million.
So far right hand title for that line is 2023-2024 annual budget, but our surplus at the end of this year, 2023, is $5 million. Am I looking at two different things?
No, in fact, I put the title in there as annual budget because that's what's available for the year.
We're never okay, thank you.
Maybe I should have just left it as surplus.
No, it made sense to me now.
Yeah. If the projection that I showed you at the start of this presentation comes true and is to the penny, which would mean I'm probably cooking the books somewhere. We would have $5,387,000. The board will have $5,387,000.
Did you want to go into the penny column on that? Just for no. Thank you.
And we'll do one more. We'll have one more projection. No, we won't have one more projection. We'll be finished the budget process because I won't be able to do April at time, but I'll be able to have a really good look at absenteeism after the April 15th and see whether or not that number tests because our salaries aren't that variable at this point. Reset. We might have the odd teacher go off and come on, but if a QP member leaves, they're replaced by exactly the same price QP member because it's based on the wage. So is the USW member. Little variance in teachers. Our variances come in what is our utility bills going to be? Is it going to be a Cold Spring? They're going to come from the use of leave permissions. So, the biggest variables are likely going to be our leaves, and we can look at that in mid-month, kind of as a check-in and see, are we right that April is going to be different this year? Here's what you've used in the past. So I know I've got a lot of slides, and so thank you for staying with me. on my budget journey, that's all wrap up at some point. You can see here that you had used your annual budgets in prior years to balance. The blue column being the surplus restriction, and the green being what you have left over in each of those years. And so kind of in that 2020, 2021 COVID year, it really spiked, didn't it? That green bar. And that was because that was such an unpredictable year to budget, and the board had a lot of external funding that came in and came out of it actually further ahead than a lot of boards in the province. Last year, when you balanced your budget, you said, let's take 2.231 and leave 2.5 in contingency. So this year, you know, if we're asking for 2, potentially, you're still left with 3.387827, which is still more than 3%. Still more than your target of contingency target. So I wanted to show you that in the visual, the graphic for you to see.
I just wanted to also comment on the 2020, 2021, that gap between the blue and the green. A lot of that money came in after budget and after September, so there was no way for the board to anticipate that. So that also accounts for that huge difference between those two items.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the board had already made decisions about we need to, you know what, if government's not paying for it, we're paying for it, and then government paid for it, and you got to take that money back into your surplus. So you had made decisions around cleaning levels and for instance, and PPE and things that then came with later grants. So I always go into risk slide because budgeting does entail a certain amount of risk in development and estimates. I should change this middle one because I've used it way too many times now. But you know, we can use our prior year's experience, known rates, and predicted trends to reduce the risk. For example, we would use that theory in establishing a rate for hydro. But we never really know how cold the winter is going to be. So that again is just an example. I'll change it in future slides. I think I've had this one for the last few years. But it's also important to not only consider financial risk. If we're overly conservative while ensuring a surplus, and this is coming from the mouth of a secretary treasurer, which are risk averse, but I also always need to be thinking about learning risk. If you're too conservative to ensure an excess surplus, then those are opportunities not for kids this year. So I think that's a difficult balance. You got financial risk, well, if we get it wrong, but that's why you have surplus contingency. But if you're too conservative, say, what's this budget for the worst case scenario? You know what? We have to add another 500,000 for absenteeism. It's going to be the coldest winter on history. We're going to need to have 30 days of snow removal, etc., etc. You then have placed, you've taken resources from the system. So we're always thinking about those risks and how to balance them. I just want you to be thinking about those two, because too conservative and somebody doesn't have resources in the classroom, not conservative enough, and we run the risk of financial risk, but we don't want to get close to having a deficit or draw more surplus than what we already are. So if if we consider options to balance with those risk factors, how risky is it to use 2 million? I'll show you at the end of this presentation. But $2 million would still leave you 3.23% of budget. And if you look on your sheet, there is a surplus tab where I work out how much, if you were to grab 2.2 million, what would we do in the budget? If you were to grab 2.4 million, what would we do in the budget? I think it's the one at the bottom. So you kind of go from that 3.23. You use 2.3, you want 3 million, 3%. If you use 3.4, you want 2.84%. This is for you to kind of have an idea. The Bank of Canada rates. We're banking on some rates there. We're in some interest rate areas and headwinds and early 2000s. And they're not hinting about it going down anytime in the future. In fact, I think they're hinting that there's another slight increase probably coming. Bank of Canada is trying to get interest rates to between 2 and 3%, and they're not there yet. So they have not seen the cooling in the economy that they thought the interest rates would have an effect on. So that's still a risk, though, is if they do drop the rates, there's $50,000 for every quarter going the other way. already gone through this. It's just on the slide and you have this in your package. You know, what is that? Where do we get that $250,000 in average teacher salary from and the 100,000 for absentee and replacement costs? I don't think I've done you read that for you. And again, about the principal increases. Don't know those things yet. And now I would like to spend a little bit of time in special purpose funds and move into the classroom enhancement fund overhead. So this is a really big fund for the board that's outside of operating. For part of it, the board has no discretion. The collective agreement tells the board that you must hire 80 more. Well, we'll have a new calculation this year, but in usual year, it tells the board you have to have 80 more teachers because of the language that was taken out of the agreement in 2002. That was restored in 2015. And here's $9.5 million to make sure you have enough money to pay for that. So that just comes. And that is one of those statutory requirements that you don't have any discretion over. You get funded for it. So what they funded us was only on 5.5% increase in that fund. So that other additional part is going to come at some point. But you do have discretion over overhead. It originally was filed with very specific. So if you have to hire 80 more teachers, there are additional costs associated with that. Those costs include those teachers' absenteeism, those teachers' pro-D, and the restoration of that collective agreement language ensured that for every teacher that had a child with a designation in the classroom, there were also professional development opportunities for them. But we were able to take it further in our application, original application to the ministry, and have additional education assistance funded. So in our collective agreement language, there are certain combinations of students that can happen in a classroom before remedy is generated. So certain designations that you're not supposed to put together. Well, that means that the supports of education assistants that would normally support potentially 2 students of similar needs in one classroom, now that those students have to be split apart, well, so do the resources. So we made the argument that we should have additional funding for education assistants and got that supported. And then we have the task of calculating remedy. So we have a new position, a new Met Carey, who came out of our accounting department recently, whose job is to do remedy support, just to calculate it. It is massive. It's $1 million a year in remedy, approximately. Massive job to calculate and track. And we're funding her wages out of this. We're proposing, because otherwise you'd have to put in the operating budget. Her wages are funded out of this fund, as we had a position last year. So here's what it looks like in this proposal. You can see the grant going from 877 to 959. It will go up again now that the shared recovery mandate is on. So we're saying we put a different position in than what was in here before for human resources support. There is the remedy coordinator. We're still holding at approximately 6 FTE education assistants. We are suggesting that leave replacements goes up because our costs have gone up. But otherwise, we're pretty consistent with inflation. We have our in-service and we have our Pro-D fund associated with those higher costs for teachers. So that would be a balanced classroom enhancement fund that is consistent with this current year, just reflecting the increases for wages. Okay, so if there's no questions on that, I'll move on. And then you have Community Link. And this is funding that's in place to support academic achievement and social functioning of vulnerable students. And decisions on the programs and services out of that fund are left to boards, but you still have some rules around how you can use it. So we would be recommending for 2023-24 the following changes: the transferring of the food programs to the new ongoing Feeding Future Fund. And then adding 2 itinerant behavior intervention workers. So this has been a goal of this fund for some time, to be able to provide those supports for those learners. And then funding the early years coordinator, position that used to be funded out of this fund. So it will look differently. So here's how it will look. So you can see again that the number held firm without any adjustment for 2021, 2022, and 2022, 2023. More money in 23-24. We bring in that early learning coordinator under our staffing, going from 0.571 FTE, which was just clerical, to the coordinator and the clerical. We have been phasing out the community school, so that was last funded in 2021, 2022. And if you remove the food program and you add the 2 positions for the behavior intervention down below, the 2 QP positions, you have a balanced budget out of Community Link. There's a question, Chair?
Through the chair to the superintendent, can you just give us just an idea of what the social, emotional, behavioral supports will be? Like, what does that look like?
Thank you. Those are predominantly student support workers, and predominantly they're in the alternate program, working with children. Predominantly, not the junior ones that we're using, but the bulk of the positions that are in here are student support workers. Some of them are based, not all entirely in the alternate program, but I'm just in the majority of them.
So regarding the itinerant workers, sometimes when you bring people in and there's more going on, should we be considering having some materials or resource or physical resource money set aside for them as well?
This is typically this would just be for the wages. Those other resources come from the operating budgets that are associated with these programs in these school sites. So for instance, if these workers were working predominantly at bulk, their supply budget is, if the students are there, that generate the supplies that they're now working with. That makes sense.
It does. I'm just going on instinct here. More people, more service, more stuff. But it obviously implicates a budget in a way. Okay.
Sorry.
If I could, I think along with some of those other supports and services would include professional learning opportunities that would occur from our learning services team. So you would, the students would generate the funds from those resources, but when it comes to their needs, they would be generated from some of the other professional opportunities that we provide.
So we've got some capacity.
Yes.
Are there any risks to transferring the food programs over to the feeding fund program?
I don't know, is it a risk of it not having enough food or?
Well, in terms, I mean, that's like, say, if the future fund program is going to be ongoing, hopefully, but if they cut that, like.
It is, our understanding is that it is ongoing, but so I don't believe there's a risk. I think this is a government commitment and it's because, at least when I read through the criteria, 20% of students in the province, need food security supports. So I don't see politically the province pulling that one back. But we know that it's in the next 3 years for sure. Because that's as far out as government goes on making funding envelope commitments. So I don't believe we would have any risk.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on my last board chair call, it was guaranteed that we have this funding for the next 3 years and it's 250,000 more. So the transfer over of that $250,000 just balances it out anyway. And we'll still have the same amount with that in there. We'll still have the same amount we had last year. Technically, if you look at it that way.
It's a bit of redundancy and based on what trustee Schmidt said, but of course, the federal budget came out with funding to go to families to support low income families to support food purchasing. That has an impact on the provincial side, and they changed their based on the federal popping up more funds, but maybe that's redundant, but if it's got a 3-year window on it, and maybe after the 3 years, it goes by the wayside. Our predictability is never predictable. We live in a dynamic. Funding is dynamic. The per pupil rate is dynamic. Grants change and they come and go, but I think I take some assurance in that the next 3 years this has been publicly announced and it is a commitment of government.
Steve Croft.
I don't think we have an option to not spend it anyway in this budget year. Not that we shouldn't be cognizant of how long of sustainability. I think it's an excellent point. Governments change, blah, 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 but Today, today we get to help out.
There's a couple other funds I just wanted to highlight. Learning Improvement Fund. And I see Adam over there, and Adam and I will be having a meeting the next month to talk about how to allocate the Learning Improvement Fund. It's jointly distributed through management and community collaboration. And so that provides currently an extra hour a week in collaboration time for education assistants at each school, for every education assistant. And it's expanded. It also goes to anybody who's, you have to be less than 7 hours in order to receive it, because you can't get income. So you have to have it, but it's so for those individuals. So this is a inflationary adjusted by inflation. So I believe it'll probably do the exact same thing next year once Adam and I meet. And a facilities grant. So that is up from 1.9 million to just under 2.4 million. So that is good news. So that is inflationary adjustments to help us support the school conditions. So that is for minor capital, roofing, siding, painting, accessibility, for instance, those types of capitals. And now here's where I want to talk about multi-year budget planning. And understand that a number of assumptions have to be made, and that this is not an exact science, but it's it's the best guess we can do to look forward and see what the future looks like, what the next 3 years budgets might look like. So when we do build a multi-year budget projection, we have to look at what we think our student enrollment is going to be, and that translates into staffing levels. So the number of students means the number of teachers, number of education assistants, the number of classrooms means the number of custodians. We have to look at what we think salary increases are going to be. We're going out further than we have collective agreements. What is the projected per pupil student rates? And that is tricky. So we try to figure out how much would the government give us for those salary increases that they bargained and are funded. What does that look like on the per pupil rate? What's inflation going to be for the next 2 years? Are we generating any future surpluses, or are we going to be in a deficit? What about multi-year initiatives and one-time initiatives? Are we doing things that are just for this year and then they go away? For instance, the space funding, the $250,000 space funding, that's one time. So we wouldn't build it in to go in each one of these years in the projection. So we have to take all that. And then build a projection model that calculates those changes in rates, those wage increases, benefit increases, surplus utilization. So I assumed that, because I don't yet know what will be funded, but we have a guarantee of 2% for wage increases next year. I use that, even though it'll probably be 3%. I also assumed, because that's what typical increases, that'll be the 24-25 year, which, no, 25-26 year, which we have no idea yet because we haven't bargained that collective agreement. And then I used 2.5% for inflation because Canada's been targeting between 2 and 3. So I'll go with 2.5. And I built this beautiful model, which is too hard to see up there. That's me for the account. This is an exciting project all come together. And what I'm trying to do here is figure out what does the future look like without any guarantees on the future. Okay. So what's that ministry grant going to look like? And there are spreadsheets behind spreadsheets and assumptions made. I think the grant is going to move from 92,550 this year to 94,185, 94,904 the next year. And you can see all the various salaries as I work through those 2%. So 2023, 2024, which is right in the middle there, but over to the right on the middle. That's the budget that is in front of you right now. I just kept it as it is. If you were to do if you were to make every adjustment, but not the principal, vice principal salaries, and balance using $2.1 million in surplus, that's what it's going to look like. And then roll it forward. Added all those inflation pressures, those wage pressures, kept the benefit rates, and they ended up then trying to figure out the revenue. That's the missing piece, I'm guessing. And I'm doing an educated calculation. So when you see the bottom line here, and if it looks incredibly frightening, it's because I don't know. But these are the types of where I think our salaries and benefits would be headed. And you can see that on the bottom column. And then I move along. Adding in 2.5% inflation to all of our services and supplies goes forward. Then I get a net revenue position. So what are we short? So for this year, we're currently, if we didn't do the principal wage increases and we said, well, everything else on there looks good, let's move forward, and we use 2.171 surplus. That's a balanced budget, and I show you how that comes off that 5.3 down at the bottom. And then I project that at the end of 2023, 2024, we'll be out by another $1 million in generating surplus because that's 1% of budget, and we tend to trend to being on the positive side of our budget. So we bring in another 1 million. So maybe at the end of 23, 2024, when you're doing your budget planning, you have 4.2 million to be considering to use. Well, what happens if you bring in 2.85? Well, maybe the next year you also generate another $1 million. Now you have 2.3 million. Well, what about the next year? Well, that's the big swing. And this is again assuming cumulative inflation, that everything goes up. Assuming government doesn't fund inflation. Really the challenge that's ahead of us is if government doesn't fund inflation and inflation continues to move forward. Then the board will have to make a decision. So this is to highlight what that looks like moving out. So I think you could reasonably have a pretty good year next year, getting yourself into that target surplus contingency. But that third year, if there isn't some adjustment, and boards will be talking about, all boards will be looking at this and talking about this, because inflation without funding is a challenge. It's going to be a really big challenge here. So that's my pessimistic conclusion. So the next steps, you as a board are much further along in your budget process than previous years, having already concluded your consultation phase. So you took the initiative to start early and start collecting information. Previous years, we may have been taking this at this time to the liaisons, and this might have been the week that you're meeting with everybody, but you've done that. You've already heard a lot and received all of that feedback in a consolidated presentation that we have to do in close. I know budgeting is transparent, but these were the partner group's comments, and we didn't want to share with anybody because they were assured those were confidential. You're now thinking about the priorities of your strategic plan and thinking about how you can balance this budget. And at the next BEBC, we're going to need to be getting closer. So we have one next week, and we're going to be needing to think about how the board wants to deal with this, whether you're going to be giving direction to staff to find further reductions because you're not comfortable with using $2.1 million in surplus, or maybe you are, and you're actually thinking we're almost done. That's for discussion when I turn this PowerPoint off. And so you have then a regular board education and business committee on April 25th. We would like to bring you a budget file at that meeting. That means that's something that you can recommend to yourself for adoption at the board meeting next week. That's in its final form. And then you'll get that balanced budget for consideration for adoption. That will be the second. You do it in 3 readings, you can hold it and do it over 2 meetings, but it needs to be done officially by June 30th. The staff need those staffing numbers to move forward with processes. So, collective agreements require that teaching staffing and PP staffing and USW staffing all has to happen within a particular time frame. So we typically have to have that 90.5% of the budget settled. And it doesn't leave you much room when it's supplies, and those are already under a lot of pressure. That's sort of the time frame. And that concludes what I have for you today. So open for any questions or comments.
Bear with me. Okay, a long one. So through the chair to Secretary Treasurer, I just want to let you know that because of inflation, I'm still really nervous about what kind of drop we're looking at for the international student program. And it makes me nervous to use the $50,000 inflation money when that might actually cover more balance of the international student program, should that really take a hit. I want to talk about previous commitments from the board, the literacy, the additional mental health, the strategic plan implementation. Yet I want to talk about that page right now, if at all possible. And to the chair, I'm not sure if this goes to the Secretary Treasurer or the Superintendent, so it can go to either if that's okay with you. Thank you. So when I look at professional ed equipment for the $40,000 for the culture of care, is that a multi-year commitment, or is that a commitment that has been taken care of already? Like, could that money be added to something else, or is that money still required under equipment?
Years ago, the province funded special education equipment separately as a special purpose fund. And that was great because, you know, annual allotment was received and then it stopped. And so what we found is that over the next decade, where that fund was no longer there, a lot of that equipment became very, very old and dated. And our numbers increased on the number of students that have needs and assessments. So it was brought to us that that was a real need in the last budget. I think actually, yeah, it was last year. That was a real need of the department. So I don't know that they fully have done that refresh yet, but you know, in future years, maybe that is a consideration, just to stabilize it a bit. But it's basically making up for funding that disappeared in the past, and then basically a decade of not keeping up with it. Yeah.
Thank you. My next question is regarding additional assessments. It was just recently brought to my attention, kids that come out of our system that don't have assessments have problems accessing programs within the community with adults unless they have an assessment. So what I'm curious about with the additional assessments, the $40,000, did that make a dent in the backload of our staff, or do we need to allot some more money to assessments to be able to take care of that, so that when we look beyond education, we know those kiddos are taken care of once they're out of our system? So just more of a sense of that.
I'll give a little bit of background. That particular budget line came from the work that we did with regard to our local education agreements. And so when we were working through some of the terms of references and the notions, some of our nations really understood that they need more psychological assessments early on. So you're making reference to maybe even later on when they transition to our post-secondary experience. So that was where that money came from, and that was the intention. And I know that inclusive ed is working toward catching up on some of those assessments. There's always more to do, and I think that Chelsea Croft comment, whether it was in a psychologist, there's always a balance between a student receiving an assessment and whether they can receive the interventions that are required from that assessment, or should it be classroom assessment? So it's a balance between those assessments and whether they should actually move forward. So psychologists, we are moving that direction to use that, but there's still more to do.
Okay, so technically the additional assessments might probably used a bit of a boost in monies. Is maybe that what I'm hearing? Through the chair,
I'm going to say that there's always places that need boosts of money, and there's probably never enough resources to go around. So I think that it's a challenging balance to have that expertise to deliver on those assessments. There's always room, I'm sure, if inclusive ed were, if you were to ask them, that they would always say, yeah, that would be great if we had a little bit more money for psychologists.
So through the chair of the superintendent, I would like to look at adding some additional dollars to the following. Making the $70,000 for additional mental health supports, their culture care from 70,000 to 100,000. I would ask that you take additional assessment $40,000 to $80,000, and special ed equipment. I would like to leave that dollar amount up to, through the chair of the superintendent, to, because we're not educators and we're not folks in that field, so we don't know exactly how much more equipment that needs, but the sooner the equipment's bought, then the better chance for all kiddos to have the opportunities they need right away. And then one other thing that I would like to talk about is the USW multi-year proposal for equipment. I know in the past we've done multi-year proposals, whether it was buying vehicles or whatever the case may be. So I'd like the Secretary Treasurer to possibly look at multi-year proposals for equipment, but I know that some of the equipment that are the ask are a little more expensive, so I'm not sure that $25,000 a year would be enough, so I'm gonna propose $50,000 a year. And I'm aware of the multi-year budgeting, and thank you for that, because I know that I'm kind of already past this year's budget and into next year's budget, because I don't want to see our board having to look at taking away. And I do want to look at board being able to sustain this long term, but I think that with what's been brought to our attention on the needs for USW equipment, that $25,000 a year I think we did it over 5 years in the past. But I would propose 3 years for now.
Questions, the affordability fund. Use some. Various things like that. What's going to happen now that students are not going to have access to that?
I think that it was a really lovely fun to have that diversity of students as well as the fun. Now it is very much focused on the Future Teachers program. I think that when we look at schools and the numbers that they have, there's always room for certain schools to have those abilities to actually support some of those needs, but they're not always there. And so I think that it was something that was used quite regularly across the board, especially at secondary schools. So it won't necessarily be there. I think that there's a small kitty at every school that they use for certain needs and certain supports that help those areas.
So it would be, I think, a tragedy if this year's kids got eyeglasses or government ID or whatever, and next year's kids don't. So I think that's something we need to be mindful of. Because the operation of all our schools, it's their kids without something, and we need to get them something for their lives, help their education. Trustee Croft.
I'd like to thank our Secretary for managing to cover the breadth and depth and complexities of budget in a mere 40 slides. Really excellent and really helpful. So thank you for that. Regarding special needs, though I completely support Trustee Schmidt's proposal in terms of the rationale, I would just like to look at it a little bit differently, and that is that I know that we had those particular line items for reasons last year, but I also know that our service to special needs kids continues to be extremely challenged. And I also know that the grad rates are not terrific either. So I'm not convinced that we have looked at the services that we provide for special needs holistically. You may have. I'm not sure that that has come to me in digestible, one document kind of thing. We hear about it here and there. So my recommendation is beside yours, in that I would really like to see if there are ways in addition to those spendings, or even in addition to those amounts that Trustee Schmidt has shared, sort of more of a whole package approach to what needs to be done, what can be done. And I love your numbers. I would be happy with bigger numbers, with so many others. But I mean, if that were to come to the table, I think it would deserve a look. So I'm just asking that just be a more of a rounded kind of examination on your part. Is that a reasonable ask? Because I don't know if I'm asking for a 5-year study here or something you can sit down and think about it.
I can respond. I think that sometimes we look at services that happen at a school site, and then certain services that happen overall at a district level. So when you think about the resources that go out to a school, you're going to have your EAs, you're going to have your support and resource room teachers to support. But at a district level, holistically, you would have your occupational therapist, you'd have your speech and language supports, you would have some psychologist support. In terms of that, you have your visual language supports. So you have some very specialized services that are for the collective organization, along with counselors. So you have that as an itinerant model. So I know that we already have that model ready and available to all trustees, and that's something that we could actually bring overall to another meeting that would show what are the school-based supports, what are the district supports. We also even have a lovely pool program for some of our students who have some complex needs. And so there are a variety of resources, and I think there's always an assumption that it's the supports that are side by side in the classroom, when it's actually the experts and the consultants that come in to provide that overall planning for the classroom and the school-based supports. So it's a myriad, like the language of our director of communications, a myriad of supports that are there. But what I think I'm hearing from you, Trustee Croft, is that you really want to see the large picture of what all those services are, school-based and district-based.
May I just perhaps offer some clarification and simplification too, and that is that the conversation so far has taken a look at some really super important line items, and I'm just saying I hope that you would feel comfortable in broadening those and I think it would be good for our deliberations.
Questions?
But first one of the things I need the answer. We didn't talk about any major capital here. And I know that's sort of a separate budget for you. So I'm just thinking of overtures, is slippage in any of those projects, and then does that then do you have to find a way to balance that with this operating budget? So things like EV Greenwall, if it costs you more to take down, or, you know, the high school end up you have some slippage there, overtures in your spending, or say the playground, albeit I know that's going to be based on a grant, but we never really talked about any of that part of your large budget, but
those projects, those projects come with very specific funding from the ministry, which is typically based on a pretty solid estimate by the time we submit it. We don't have any fear of AB Greenwell will be funded for whatever it costs. For instance, it's down in Gordon will be funded for whatever it costs, but there is from time to time that we enhance a project, but we always have a funding source for that first. So that might be through an annual facilities grant, or where we have been under on a project, the ministry has allowed us to carry those over and do some further enhancement. But we haven't had the experience where we've had to go into the operating budget historically to balance any capital.
And then my second question was, these were rollover initiatives. It's hard to see where they're starting, where they're ending. So you've tried your best at that 712,965 to give a balance between the 2 year of spending.
Yeah, I was trying to just show you what have been the last couple of years of initiatives, because you know, we're not flush with money moving forward. And you've had many asks, and some of those asks that you had received may have been reflected in some of those items that were already done. So that was my goal to ensure that, of course, not inclusive of everything that's in the budget. This is where you changed the order things in the last year.
What do you say?
Just in regards to our diverse learners and thank you, Trustee Schmidt, for bringing forward your recommendations for increasing funding. And I'm just, the only thing that I don't see here or don't know is identified gaps. So is there a priority that is just screaming at us that is an identified gap in the system? So for example, speech and language pathologists or occupational therapists in comparison to where we should be and where we are.
I would say that in front of you, of course, I know the Secretary of Treasury has provided you with a little bit of an overall budget around learning and how much we get funded versus how much I couldn't say that we need one more of those specialty areas than another. And I think that when you look at the cost related to each one of those areas, it's quite, when you look at even a 0.1 FTE, you're looking at thousands of dollars. And so I think that part of maybe the initiatives that have been brought forward in the past, and maybe it's also the look that maybe trustee Croft is looking for, is that if you looked at the 70,000, the 50,000, the 40,000, it starts at 110,000. So is there priorities within that larger scope that could be teased out to support the identified areas that you're referring to? We know that those specialty services are always needed. We have a strong relationship with some of the service providers at the early years level who help us identify some of the learners who need those services. Right? Because we know if we can support those learners early and catch them, able to support them. And so I couldn't say that exactly what are the particular areas, because I think that part of what we do, we have formulas in how we support our learners. We have those district support. We have processes where they get those requests met from each of the school areas. So I think it may be prudent to look at something that's more holistic in nature. So you could tease out those areas that need to be resourced in a certain year, in a certain half year, whatever they may be.
Trustee Smith. Trustee Quinn.
Through the chair to the secretary treasurer, when it comes to Cowichan Secondary project right now, and we talked about this a long time ago, and I actually haven't followed it up, so that's why I'm asking the question today. This was a budget impact, but we talked about getting the real furniture the kids need to learn with, and that may not necessarily be this, that, the other, like a desk and like some of those one unit things that still sit at Quamichan. Why, I don't know. But we had talked about whether there's going to be enough money in the budget for real furniture and not stuff that's coming from the old Cal High. Is there going to be a need to spend some operating budget to cover furniture, or is there going to be enough money left in the project to cover the furniture for Cowichan Secondary? Because I would hate to put a brand new school and move some furniture that really shouldn't be in that school in that school.
I don't know that I can answer that right now. I think that work is being done to do that costing. We have a procurement consultant on contract right now. I will say that we still have a couple of $1 million worth of contingency on that project.
We'll have enough for furniture.
That we are under budget on, that we would potentially be able to ask the ministry for access to.
Okay. Thank you.
Trustee Quinn.
Sort of passed, but I wanted to comment on your regarding gaps in that. I just wanted to offer that historically, in terms of solving bigger problems, I was going to say the board, but really staff have discovered that sometimes you can find one or two pieces that address multiple gaps across the system. And so that was sort of what, going for the broader overview, we might find the one piece that affects a lot of pieces rather than, and I think there's some complexities to consider too. One of which is, I don't think it's totally easy to hire EAs today. So what do we do instead, right? So that's why I was just hoping that that comment would give some flexibility to your developer.
I've got notes on feedback, particularly the items brought up by Trustee Board Chair Schmidt. Those would add approximately $95,000 net to the budget opening position. Are the board, I guess I'm kind of I'm trying to get a consensus. Is the board more comfortable with using around $2.3 million worth of surplus, which is everything we've presented, plus these additions, or would you be asking staff to go and look for some offsetting reductions?
I am comfortable with the board, with the staff looking at using the surplus dollars.
And not looking for more reductions. So I didn't have that offset, so that's why I just needed to ask that question. So if we bring back those proposals, that will be how that will look.
Any other questions or comments? Speak up.
I have a question for superintendent. And this is a big question, but we've had brief conversations about it, so I hope I don't surprise you with this. And that is that you know, we're asking for some significant changes, especially around special needs, but in other places. And I'm thinking about your comment about sustainability, and we seem kind of bought in at this point to the idea of doing it out of surplus. So my question to you is, I'm going to tell you my position, and you can tell me if I'm crazy. And that is that if we can give some kids a year or two of an improved educational experience, is that worth it in the long run? I think back to kids who've had that one great year in school and it's with them for years. We may not be able to sustain it, but is that what, are we in danger? If we can't sustain this, are we in danger of any long-term educational harm?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that during a pandemic experience that we've probably experienced the fact that children had a very different circumstance during that time. Some have had a more positive experience. They got to be home with their parents, they had surrounded by a community, very different education at their home front versus others who may be more vulnerable. The way I look at it is that in the past, we have not had the type of food money that has been brought forward by the feeding programs that have been there. In partnerships with small, like Rotary, small grocery stores who will support their local school, that type of thing. So this is the first time in my experience that these kinds of monies and funds have come to feed children. So I think that if we look at two parts of this, supporting children around literacy and numeracy, and this is very relevant. And I think that we could use that language of, you know, if they are able to have those foundational skills, be at a grade 4, grade 5 level, that they will be able to move forward in their area of passion because they can read and they can write, but they're well fed. I would hope that when you make that comment around those educational experiences, we all know children who had this great teacher in that 1 year. Grade 3 was my favorite teacher per se, or this year. And sometimes it's not about the resources. It's about the relationship that they have with their network of adults around them. And so it really is around the work that we are doing, the social emotional needs, the mental health plans and supports of the people who are within the range of children. So when I think about the mental health supports and the monies that have been put forward, we know that the schools are doing excellent work around getting feedback by students and staff and parents around what do the students need. We also know that our counselors are not clinical counselors. They are there to actually do a short-term solution to find the resources that they need out of our system. You know, however, we know there's always a trouble spot there. But I like your question because I think that what we always try to do is design our resources to target what's important in that year. And so I think right now we're targeting resources in the right places for the year that we're in after a pandemic, when they might need some mental health supports. So we're doing that wide, broad work that is very supportive of the social emotional needs of children, along with those foundational skills that are important, which is K to 12. Yeah. But we're long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
So we're good.
I think we are.
We talk about risk as far as educational risk and risk of not having services for kids. And we heard it really when we sat here and talked to a bunch of kids in January about they needed more adults in schools. Are we addressing that, or do we need to is it worth cutting down, and I'm a conservative budget guy, is it worth cutting down our surplus?
I'm gonna answer that question. When you think about the average ratio between an adult in the building and kids, you're probably looking at about one to 10, somewhere from that. I think it's the relationship that kids have with those adults that are more important than the number of people that may be surrounding those children. And I had a great opportunity to meet with DFAC today to ask him about giving me feedback on how to hear their voices in terms of their educational experiences. And they gave me some very, very great feedback. Namely that I need to come in not as a super, that I maybe need to wear a sweatshirt and be a little bit more part of the fabric of the school. And that maybe I need to actually talk to some of the adults who are very supportive around them. And that would have been their EAs, their support teachers, and those folks, because those kids talk to those people in the building. And so I think that in public education, we are never funded enough. We know that. We always need more resources. But I think overall, if we look at as a comprehensive, that is everyone's collective responsibility to support children in our system, and that we really help to build bridges between adults and children through professional learning and development. We treat our children very differently in this decade than we did in the last decade or the decade before. We have such higher expectations of ourselves and how we actually treat people respectfully, with care and dignity. And so I think that I don't believe we're at risk. I think that we continue to educate our adults and we continue to educate our children. So I think that right now I think we've got the formula and the recipe quite right in terms of their learning, finding their passion, and also treating all of them with dignity.
That was good. I was glad to hear that. So we don't need to fund more money for sweatshirts in. Hey, do we have any other questions or comments? Well,
Honestly, this has been a really good conversation. I just feel, I just think that more fuzzy feel. You know, it seems silly, but just to work with a great group of people and our staff. And I know that it's not just you two, that everybody here, right, contributed to those documents and to all the rationale and information. And I'm just grateful to be part of this team. And I just say thank you all. Good job. Thanks, Randy.
thank you. So we've got another BEBC budget meeting coming up next Thursday again at 4 o'clock. What we talked about today. Further, office hoping we can recommend it to the board on our May 2nd. Oh, thank you very much to all for all your hard work and thank you very much.